I don't think actually a theocratic Iran can be contained even without nuclear weapons. I think there's a confrontation in our future between our civilization, I'll say that without embarrassment, the world that at least respects, if it doesn't always practice, the rule of law, and that has devised certain forms of diplomacy and certain systems of arms control to which the Iranians are legally signatories, and a regime that has the clearly expressed ambition to break out of and to trample all those conventions.
A couple months ago, I made a video talking about how New Atheism paved the way for the alt-right by its continued criticism of the left and of liberals not being hard enough on religion, namely Islam, in the wake of 9/11. So you might want to go watch that video before this one, but in this video we're going to talk specifically why the alt-right like the New Atheist movement, why they like a lot of the arguments they make. And with this framing in mind, when you hear a lot of the stuff I'm going to read you and play for you today, it's super problematic, and it will make you realise how, you know, like I said before, these guys did pave the way for the alt-right, not just through their criticisms of leftists being weak, I guess, on Islamic terrorism, but also because they share a lot of the same arguments in regard to Islam, immigration, and I guess foreign policy. But before we get any further, if you want to support my work, please like the video, maybe subscribe to the channel. Most of my videos are demonetized, so if you want to have a look at my Patreon as well, in the description, anything people give me there is much appreciated. And the rest of my social media links and Discord are also in the description. Now, this was the focus of my last video, but I just want to quickly talk about the Clash of Civilisations by Samuel Huntington and 9/11. Basically, this author wrote a piece about Islam and the West in the mid-1990s, saying that after the fall of the Soviet Union and, you know, the communist bloc, the ideological battle would now be between Western civilization and Islamicism. This is, of course, due to the rise in various insurgent movements, the rise of Al-Qaeda, the rise of a theocratic state like Iran. But when 9/11 happened, a lot of people started to look back at this work and said, you know, this guy got it right before it even happened. And Huntington's ideas and theories became really dominant in Western foreign policy. And you can see that a lot in the neoconservatism of the Bush administration. But of course, the New Atheist movement also believed very similar stuff. They actually gained a lot of prominence during this period because they would say stuff similar to Samuel Huntington. They would focus specifically on Islam and all the problems that Islam and Islamicism brings. Now, I always found the New Atheist grasp of geopolitics really lacking. So here is Christopher Hitchens discussing Iran and why he thinks Iran is an existential threat to the West, even if it doesn't have a nuclear weapon.
Well, since we're on that topic, do you think a nuclear Iran can be contained?
No. I don't think actually a theocratic Iran can be contained even without nuclear weapons. I think there's a confrontation in our future between our civilization, I'll say that without embarrassment, the world that at least respects, if it doesn't always practice, the rule of law, and that has devised certain forms of diplomacy and certain systems of arms control to which the Iranians are legally signatories, and a regime that has the clearly expressed ambition to break out of and to trample all those conventions. We already see it in the threats to their Arab Sunni neighbors in countries like Bahrain, in their export of violence, as far away as murdering Jewish community leaders in Argentina, or Kurdish exiles in Berlin and Vienna, for heaven's sake, or a novelist friend of mine living in London writing fiction. I think they've asked for a fight and should know that on those conditions they certainly will get one.
So Hitchens likes to frame it as like Iran versus civilization, because the West represents civilization. And this is a popular theme you'll see in New Atheist thinking. It's Western civilization is the best. And it goes to my general theory that the new fascism you are seeing in Western countries isn't just strictly related to traditional fascism, which of course goes hand in hand often with Christian nationalism. It's also Western chauvinism, where you have groups like Christian nationalists ally themselves with ex-Christian atheists and other far-right groups, and they proclaim West is the best, Islam is backward, that is, you know, a bunch of barbarians, we need to stop that immigration because it's going to ruin all the gains Western civilization has made. And this is why I believe the alt-right and the far-right figures really do like new atheists in general, not just for paving the way for them, but because they share the same argument that the Islamic world is backwards. They are savages, they are barbarians, where the enlightened Western world, from the Judeo-Christian tradition, you know, they're so civilized. And they often like to use very violent language to describe the struggle between the West and Islam. So we started with Hitchens, but let's move on to Harris. In my last video, I talked about his quotes about Islam and nuclear weapons and everything like that. So I'm going to leave that in the other video, even though I think it's quite telling. But I'm going to focus more on immigration and demographics and Western civilization here with his quotes. So to start with Harris's Letter to a Christian Nation, when he discusses Europe, he says, Islam is now the fastest growing religion in Europe. The birth rate among European Muslims is 3 times that of their non-Muslim neighbours. If current trends continue, France will be a majority Muslim country in 25 years, and that is if immigration were to stop tomorrow. Now, this isn't just some sort of comment on immigration in France. Of course, he thinks this is a very, very, very bad thing that's going to happen. And of course, it plays into a lot of what's happening in France right now, with the centrists under Macron trying to take steam out of the far right by making these extremely controversial laws towards Islamic communities in the wake of Charlie Hebdo attack and other attacks they perceive are attacks on the foundations of the French Republic. So let's get on to more recent quotes. So a couple years ago, Sam Harris had a conversation with a guy called Douglas Murray, who wrote a book about Europe basically being taken over by Islamicism and why they letting that happen, why they letting all the gains of Western civilization be defeated by the refugees coming over from Syria and Libya and Iraq and all these countries we've intervened in and created extremely awful conditions. And they both discuss how this poses a real threat. But I'm just going to play you Sam Harris's intro rather than the conversation because it is like an hour long. But here we will see he plays into sort of great replacement, white replacement theories that the alt-right love to talk about so much, and that goes far back to his older work as well.
Douglas and I spent a lot of time in this podcast, certainly most of the time, talking about the situation in Europe with respect to immigration and Islam and the social attitudes in the Muslim community that are at odds with values that really should be, really must be non-negotiable, like free speech and women's rights and gay rights. And what I'd like to point out is that neither of us are against immigration. And you might not notice that in the first hour or so. And we're not against Muslim immigration. In fact, both of us count among our friends Muslims and former Muslims who are precisely the sorts of people we are most concerned to protect. And in particular, we're worried about protecting them from many of the illiberal people who have been pouring into Europe. In this one, we more or less fully agree on what we're against. And what we're against is Western civilization committing suicide. And if you think that puts the matter too strongly, you haven't read Douglas's book, and you probably haven't been paying much attention to what's been happening in Europe. And if you think one has to be a fan of Trump in order to worry about this, well, then you haven't been paying attention to this podcast. But on the topic of Trump, Trump just gave a speech in Poland where he said, and I quote, "The fundamental question of our time is whether the West has the will to survive. Do we have the confidence in our values to defend them at any cost? Do we have enough respect for our citizens to protect our borders? Do we have the desire and the courage to preserve our civilization in the face of those who would subvert or destroy it?" End quote. And while I find abundant fault with the messenger, as you know, I can't find fault with that particular message. And the fact that liberals can't seem to see what's at stake here, the fact that they are embarrassed to defend, quote, Western values, as though that were synonymous with racism, or the legacy of colonialism, or xenophobia, or a lack of compassion, that is making liberalism politically defunct at this point. And that increasingly worries me. And happily in the United States, we are in a better situation demographically and with respect to immigration and just geographically. And that has implications for immigration. But one cannot be cheerful about what's been happening in Europe.
Now, this came out 3 years ago, and it's already pretty hilarious to me, because they're talking about Now, this came out 3 years ago, and it's already pretty hilarious to me. They're talking about Trump, they're talking about Western civilization, they're talking about a Trump speech given in Poland. And Sam Harris is like, oh, you see what's going on in Europe with Muslim immigration. How about what's happening in Poland right now? Is Poland and the Polish government representative of Western values? So Poland has recently passed laws against abortion. It's recently passed measures against the LGBT community. Poland, Hungary, other countries like that veering towards Christian fascism. These are Western values. These are also two countries, might I add, that don't accept a lot of refugees. In Hungary particularly, they don't do that. So am I supposed to take the argument that Trump saying we must stand up for Western values in Poland, and Hungary, I guess, also comes into the West, that's meant to be something to aspire to? These are two countries that are leading the fight against refugees, where they also happen to be some of the worst offenders for this far-right discrimination. This whole intro is obviously aged like milk from Sam Harris, but let's get into the other points where he talks about the US being in a better position in terms to demographics. He's probably referring to the US having less Muslims in it than Britain or France or a variety of other European countries. Again, just because Muslims live in these countries, they pose an inherent threat to Western civilization. Again, the racism and xenophobia in his language is just pretty staggering. It's just pretty blatant. And you can see why the alt-right love New Atheists, because they intellectualize just old-style bigotry. Again, he's talking about Poland, the West, Donald Trump, saying how these figures aren't rooted in colonialism, xenophobia and racism. But at the same time, in 2020, look what is going on in these countries. Look what's going on in the lesser diverse countries. Look what's going on in the countries that don't have large Muslim communities. And I'm not saying somehow having communities of different religions makes countries inherently better, but when you have countries like Poland and Hungary, which mainly subscribe to a similar religion across the country, compared to some other ones which are, a lot more diverse. I'd rather live in London and New York than Poland, for example, because the diversity really helps make people more tolerant, in my opinion. But also something New Atheists never really acknowledge about, the refugee crisis, or as they like to say it, the migrant crisis, is think about the types of people coming over. They're literally some of the poorest people on earth. Refugees don't leave their countries for no reason. They literally leave everything behind. They have no capital. They're going to have no influence when they come to these countries. They're probably going to have to do the most awful jobs. They might not speak the language. They might be trapped in a cycle of poverty for the rest of their life. Do you think these are the type of people to take over the government and make, a Islamic theocratic France or Britain? Again, these people don't seem to realise that even if these refugees believe in very, very right-wing Islam, that does not translate to a country becoming Islamic. You have multiple examples across the world of minority rule. And the West loved to do this during the Cold War and the colonial times to help strengthen their position. So Assad in Syria is from a Muslim minority there. He doesn't represent the majority in terms of religion. Think about South Vietnam back in the day. The people the Americans and French put into power were Vietnamese Catholics. Because even if these countries become majority Muslim, it doesn't matter if most of the Muslim community coming over here from other countries are refugees or extremely poor, or they come from countries like Pakistan or Bangladesh, some of the poorest in that region. What are they going to hope to achieve? Most people come here looking for a better life to start with. They don't come here with goals to make, an Islamic republic of Great Britain. Even if Britain was majority Muslim, even if Britain was majority right-wing Muslim, that still doesn't translate to an Islamic government or Islam taking over and all these countries looking Islamic. And again, need I point to numerous examples? Arab socialism used to be dominant in North Africa. These dictators were secular. The majority of the population weren't secular. but they still held on to power. They still dominated politics in their countries for decades and decades. The fundamental flaw in their arguments is that somehow having a majority population of one religion results in certain things, especially if you don't assess their access to power. Britain is controlled by right-wing Christians. It always has been, probably always will. We can't even topple them from the left in this country. So you think right-wing Muslims are going to topple them? Again, it's a massively, massively flawed argument. But to move on from that conversation, he talked about Western civilization. And again, I said it's a dominant thing that both the alt-right and new atheists love to talk about. West is the best. It's basically, in my opinion, they make a broad coalition of Western chauvinists. And in a typical Orientalist fashion, it basically just ignores all the breakthroughs in various different things, whether that is human rights or rights of people, from throughout the rest of the world. You know, India, China, historically, Babylon, which created the first human rights in the whole world by Cyrus the Great. It's not unique to the West. What is unique to the West is through massive colonialism, massive exploitation, and massive theft of the rest of the world's resources, we've been able to enrich ourselves to a position where we dominate global affairs, to a position where through the wealth, education, everything like that, we have the luxuries of free speech and supposed freedom. We've become less religious and we've become more powerful. And we've done that at the expense of the rest of the world, including many Muslim countries, which we've continually exploited for oil, but historically exploited for everything. So it's not something unique to this country, and historically it's not unique to the West at all. So Harris also had Charles Murray, the author of The Bell Curve, the widely debunked racist book that asserts that IQ is linked to race, something that of course groups like the Nazis loved similar concepts of, and something that most of the alt-right, most of the far-right really love to talk about. So throughout the video, I hope you've seen why the alt-right like these people and why they like their arguments, and like in my other video, how they helped pave the way for the alt-right. But let's go back to a guy who describes himself as the inventor of the term alt-right. Let's talk about Richard Spencer, who was interviewed by an atheist called David McAfee. So McAfee asks him, "Are you religious? Do you support the separation of church and state?" And Spencer says, "I'm an atheist. The separation of church and state is an utter illusion. The state and religion are deeply connected." McAfee says, "So despite your lack of religion, you do think religion and government should be connected. Is that right? Do you think a secular government would fail?" Spencer says, "A truly secular government can never exist. Sovereignty is a magical thing. For a political order to function, for it to accomplish its task, including war making, the population must believe in it. I first started using alternative right in the summer of 2008. At the time, it was a much broader tent, referring to lots of different versions of the right that opposed George Bush and the conservative movement." So when you've watched my two videos on this, is it surprising that Richard Spencer is a massive atheist? Is it surprising he's probably somewhat influenced by these sort of arguments towards Islam after 9/11. And I also find it funny he doesn't think there should be a separation of church and state. In his opinion, I think it's because he wants the populace to believe in something, and you know, he probably wants to make them do stuff. But it's also funny that a lot of these ex-Christians just don't really care about the separation of religion when it's Christianity from a lot of the stuff in their society. But when it's Islam, it's extremely problematic. So in summary, New Atheism has pushed numerous far-right arguments against Islam, against immigration, and they don't have a good understanding of socio-economic factors. They don't have a good understanding of geopolitics. They don't have a good understanding of capitalism or imperialism. They really live in a theoretical world where if a Muslim immigrates to another country, or if a Muslim refugee comes to another country, and if there's enough of them, they're going to take over that country with their religion. And it's no wonder the alt-right and far-right really pounce upon these arguments and take them even further. Anyway, let me know what you guys think in the description. If you want to follow me on social media, at the Kavernacle on Twitter and Instagram, join my Discord in the description, join my subreddit, and follow me on my personal Reddit. Also, please check out my Patreon in the description, and if you made it this far, thank you for watching.